Japanese compact pickup that silenced the American mini-truck. In 1972, Toyota shipped a small pickup truck to the United States. It weighed less than 3,000 pounds. It had a four-cylinder engine that made a modest 89 horsepower. American automakers looked at it and laughed. By 1986, it was the best-selling pickup truck in California. The laughing stopped. This is the story of the Toyota Hilux and its American sibling, the Toyota pickup, a truck that American manufacturers did not take seriously until it was far too late, a machine so overbuilt for its class that it essentially invented an entirely new expectation for what a small truck should be. And along the way, it dismantled one of the most profitable segments that Detroit ever had. But to understand why this matters, you have to understand what the American mini-truck market looked like before the Japanese showed up. The early 1960s were the golden age of the American compact truck. Ford had the Ranchero, Chevrolet had the El Camino, International Harvester had the Scout. These were vehicles that American manufacturers built because they could, not necessarily because they had thought deeply about what a small, working truck needed to be. They were cheap to produce, fairly cheap to buy, and they filled a niche: small farms, delivery work, tradesmen who did not need a full-size F-100. The problem was how they were built. American compact trucks of this era were engineered with the assumption that buyers would replace them. Rust was considered a feature, not a bug, at least from the manufacturer's perspective. Engine longevity past 100,000 miles was not a design priority. Service intervals were short. Repair costs were significant. The business model was not entirely different from selling a disposable product. Chevrolet launched the LUV, the light utility vehicle, in 1972. It was actually an Isuzu, rebadged and sold through Chevy dealers. Ford launched the Courier the same year, which was a Mazda. Even American manufacturers were quietly admitting that they could not build a small truck cheaply enough to compete on their own. They just did not tell the public that. Toyota was doing something different. They were not trying to undercut the American market on price alone. They were trying to outbuild it. The Toyota Hilux had been around since 1968. The name Hilux came from high luxury, which tells you something about Toyota's ambition for the segment and also something about 1960s Japanese marketing. It was a simple truck, rear-wheel drive, a small four-cylinder engine, a short bed. Nothing about the specification sheet would make you stop and stare. What made it different was underneath. Toyota had built the Hilux with a chassis that was, frankly, over-engineered for the market it was entering. The frame construction used a ladder design with deeper rails than competitors at the same price point. The suspension geometry was set up for load-bearing, not just light hauling. The corrosion protection on the undercarriage was several steps above what American manufacturers were doing with comparable vehicles. The engine was a 2-liter unit displacing 122 cubic inches. It made 89 horsepower in early U.S. trim. That number did not impress anyone on paper, but it was not about peak power. It was about the power curve and what happened when you drove the thing for 10 years. The engine was designed to be maintained simply, repaired cheaply, and to keep running in conditions that would strand most comparable American products. American dealers who first encountered the Toyota pickup, the name used in the U.S. market, frequently reported that customers were skeptical. This was 1972. Made in Japan still carried significant baggage from the post-war era. There were buyers who would not walk into a Toyota dealership on principle. Toyota knew this. Their response was not to argue about it. It was to let the trucks accumulate mileage and then stand back. Here is where the story gets interesting. By the mid-1970s, something was happening in the used vehicle market that nobody had planned for. Toyota pickups from the early years of U.S. sales were not disappearing. They were still running. Farmers who had bought them on price because they were cheaper than comparable American trucks at point of sale discovered that the total cost of ownership over 5 years was dramatically lower. Mechanics who worked on them reported that the engines were straightforward, the parts were available, and the repair procedures were not designed to require dealer-only tooling. Word spread the way word spreads when something genuinely works, not through advertising, through the guy at the feed store who had put 150,000 miles on his 73, and it still ran. The 1978 model year was significant. Toyota introduced a revised version of the truck in the U.S. that addressed the one legitimate complaint American buyers had: interior quality. The early trucks were Spartan to a degree that even pragmatic buyers found uncomfortable. The 78 update improved the cab, the dash layout, the seat comfort, and added options that American buyers expected. It kept everything that had made the truck reliable. It added what had been missing. Sales started to climb in ways that alarmed people at Ford and General Motors. 1979 brought the oil crisis. This is the event that most automotive historians point to when explaining the Japanese compact truck invasion, and they are not wrong, but they are only partially right. The fuel economy argument was real. A Toyota pickup getting around 25 miles per gallon on the highway versus a full-size American truck getting 12 to 14 was a legitimate selling point when gasoline was rationed and prices had doubled overnight. But the oil crisis did not create the Toyota pickup's reputation. It amplified it. Buyers who switched to the Toyota because of fuel costs discovered, 1, 2, 3 years later, that they had also accidentally bought one of the most reliable vehicles they had ever owned. The fuel crisis sent them to the showroom. The build quality kept them there. By 1980, Toyota was selling over 200,000 units per year in the United States. The Datsun, soon to be Nissan, truck was close behind. Ford was watching its courier, the rebadged Mazda it had been selling, struggle to keep up with vehicles that buyers trusted more. Chevrolet's LUV was in the same position. The rebadging strategy had been a hedge. It turned out to be an admission. General Motors launched the S10 in 1982. Ford launched the Ranger the same year. These were genuine American-built compact trucks, not rebadged imports, and they were good vehicles. The S10 in particular was praised at launch: modern styling, decent powertrain options, American dealer network, strong warranty support. They competed, they sold, they did not win. The reason they did not win is what the mid-roll pause is for, because this is the part where you need to slow down and actually look at the numbers. If you're into this kind of story, the engineering behind why one vehicle beats another, why some machines last and others don't, hit subscribe. We cover this kind of thing every week. Okay, back to it. The S10 and the Ranger were designed with 5 to 7 year ownership cycles in mind. That was not a conspiracy. It was a business model. American manufacturers in the early 1980s were engineering vehicles to meet customer expectations over typical ownership periods, usually the length of a loan. If a truck made it to 80,000 miles with reasonable maintenance costs, that was a success by the metrics they were measuring. Toyota was engineering for something different. The internal target for the pickup, this is documented in Toyota's production philosophy materials from the period, was a vehicle that a working owner could run for 15 years with regular maintenance without requiring major mechanical intervention. That goal shaped every decision from the frame to the valve train to the corrosion treatment on the bed mounting hardware. The numbers that came out of this philosophy were startling. Third-party reliability surveys from the early 1980s, J.D. Power was becoming a factor in this period, showed Toyota pickups with defect rates roughly 40% lower than comparable American trucks in the first year of ownership. Long-term surveys showed the gap widening. At 100,000 miles, a Toyota pickup had a substantially higher probability of still running than an S10 or Ranger of the same age, adjusted for maintenance. This is the part where we get into the actual engineering, because the numbers do not happen by accident. The engine that powered the Toyota pickup through much of its most successful period in the United States was the 22R series, specifically the 22RE, when fuel injection arrived in 1981. The engine displaced 2.4 liters, 146 cubic inches. It made 106 horsepower in injected form. Not impressive on paper. The design was a single overhead cam with a chain drive, not a belt. This matters. The timing chain on the 22RE was engineered to last the life of the engine with normal oil changes. No timing belt service interval, no catastrophic failure mode at 90,000 miles when a belt snapped and the pistons met the valves. This was a deliberate design choice that added modest complexity at the manufacturing stage and removed a significant cost and failure point over the vehicle's lifetime. The combustion chamber geometry was a pent roof design, 2 valves per cylinder with an angled arrangement that promoted efficient fuel mixing. Nothing revolutionary, everything competent. The compression ratio was a modest 8.8 to 1, which meant the engine ran cleanly on regular fuel and was not stressed at its operating parameters. Bore and stroke were 88 millimeters and 89 millimeters respectively. Nearly square, the bore and stroke were almost identical. Square engines tend to be balanced between low-end torque and high-rev power delivery. The 22RE was not a torque monster. It was not a high-revving sports car engine. It was calibrated for the middle ground where pickup trucks actually live, pulling a moderate load at highway speeds for sustained periods without thermal stress. The oiling system was built with wider tolerances than the American competition. This is where a lot of the long-term reliability advantage came from. Wider oil passages, a higher capacity oil pump, and an oil cooler option that became standard on later trucks all contributed to an engine that ran cooler and with lower internal friction over extended service life. The result was an engine that showed comparatively little wear at 100,000 miles compared to engines running tighter tolerances at higher temperatures. Fuel injection on the 22RE used Toyota's own EFI system, developed in-house. American emissions regulations were becoming increasingly strict through the early 1980s, and carbureted engines were struggling to meet the standards cleanly at all operating temperatures. Toyota's fuel injection system managed fuel delivery with electronic precision, which satisfied regulators, improved throttle response, and contributed to the fuel economy numbers that continued to make the truck competitive on operating cost. The transmission options tell a similar story. The standard 5-speed manual gearbox, the W Series unit, had synchromesh on all forward gears including first, which was not universal in this class at the time. First gear synchromesh made low-speed maneuvering with a load easier and reduced the mechanical abuse the gearbox suffered from drivers who were not expert manual transmission operators. The clutch engagement was progressive. Nothing about the drivetrain was difficult to use. The optional automatic was a 4-speed unit that Toyota sourced and refined internally. It was not exciting. It worked. It kept working. Moving to the chassis, this is where the overengineering becomes most visible. The ladder frame used rails that were, at the main section, a C-channel measuring roughly 5 inches in depth. For a compact truck, this was substantial. The cross members were welded and, in key load areas, additionally gusseted. The frame did not flex significantly under load, which meant the body mounting points did not fatigue, which meant the body did not develop creaks and structural issues over time. The front suspension was independent using double wishbones. Rear was a solid axle with leaf springs, conventional and proven. The rear axle housing itself was heavy for the class. The differential was a conventional unit without limited slip as standard, but the unit was rated significantly above the truck's actual load capacity. You could not overwork it through normal use. Corrosion protection started at the factory with a phosphate treatment on the body panels before painting, a wax injection into the body cavities, and a rubberized undercoating on the frame and lower body. American trucks of the period used some of these methods, not all of them, not as thoroughly. The Toyota pickup's resistance to rust, particularly in northern markets where road salt was applied heavily, became one of the most discussed advantages among owners over time. Bed construction used a double-wall design on the sides, and the bed floor was formed steel with rolled edges that did not trap water. The tailgate hinges were oversized. The stake pockets were reinforced. Someone had thought about what happened to these parts over 15 years of use and designed accordingly. The four-wheel drive version introduced to U.S. buyers deserves specific attention. Toyota offered a part-time four-wheel drive system with manual locking hubs, a decision that prioritized drivetrain longevity over convenience. Automatic locking hubs, which American manufacturers were offering, introduced additional mechanical complexity and additional failure modes. Manual hubs were a slightly more involved process for the driver and significantly more reliable over time. Off-road users who actually needed four-wheel drive traction understood and appreciated this. The system worked. Ground clearance on the four-wheel drive variant was 8 inches. The approach angle was generous. The suspension articulation was adequate for genuine off-road use. Toyota was not designing a truck for the perception of off-road capability. They were designing one for actual off-road use, and the difference showed. The payload rating on the standard Toyota pickup through the early 1980s was 1,450 pounds. That number is worth examining. The S10 and Ranger were rated in the same general range. But owner reports and independent tests consistently showed that Toyota's payload figure was conservative. The truck would handle loads at and somewhat above its rated capacity without structural strain. American competitors tested similarly, showed more evident stress at rated capacity. When you build something with margins, the margins show up in service life. The consequences of all this were felt first in the used truck market, then in new truck sales, and finally in the financial reports of American automakers. By 1985, a 3-year-old Toyota pickup retained roughly 70% of its original purchase price in resale value. A comparable S10 or Ranger retained approximately 55 to 60%. For a buyer financing a truck purchase, the Toyota's residual value advantage was meaningful. It translated directly into lower effective cost of ownership when the vehicle was eventually sold or traded. Dealers noticed. This was not sentiment. It was the beginning of the end of the Japanese auto industry. This was not sentiment. It was calculation. High-mileage Toyotas were still dependable transportation. High-mileage American compact trucks were a gamble. The impact on fleet buyers accelerated this dynamic. Small contractors, landscape companies, local delivery operations, businesses that tracked vehicle costs carefully began specifying Toyota pickups in their purchasing guidelines. When a fleet manager could demonstrate to an owner that the Toyota's 5-year total cost, including maintenance, repairs, and resale, was significantly lower than the American alternative, the conversation about purchase price became shorter. Ford and General Motors were not asleep through this. The Ranger received regular updates and improvements throughout the 1980s. The S10 was revised. Both trucks got better. Both trucks closed some of the quality gap. By the late 1980s, the reliability difference between the best American compact trucks and the Toyota had narrowed meaningfully. But Toyota had created a reputation that proved nearly impossible to overturn in the short term. Consumer perception of reliability, once established, is sticky. Buyers who had owned a Toyota pickup and had the experience of watching it accumulate miles without drama did not need convincing the next time. The conversion rate from first purchase to second purchase at Toyota dealerships for truck buyers was exceptionally high throughout this period. The tariff dimension of this story is not minor. In 1981, the Reagan administration negotiated voluntary export restraints with Japan, an agreement that limited Japanese automakers to selling a fixed number of vehicles in the United States per year. For passenger cars, this created a strange incentive structure. Japanese manufacturers, constrained in how many units they could sell, shifted their production toward higher-margin vehicles. This is widely credited as one of the factors that pushed Japanese automakers upmarket and eventually produced the Lexus and Acura brands. For trucks, the calculation was somewhat different. Compact pickups faced a 25% import tariff, the chicken tax, that dated back to a 1963 trade dispute involving German chicken imports and American trucks. Yes, really? The tariff was a retaliation measure that ended up lasting for decades and shaped the entire American truck market. Toyota's response was to begin manufacturing trucks in the United States. The Fremont, California plant, a joint venture with General Motors called NUMMI, New United Motor Manufacturing, began producing Toyota pickups for the American market in 1984. The NUMMI arrangement was itself one of the more remarkable industrial stories of the decade. General Motors wanted access to Toyota's production methods. Toyota wanted American manufacturing capacity to sidestep the chicken tax. The result was a factory staffed largely by former GM workers, many of them from a plant that GM had closed for productivity problems, trained in Toyota's production system and turning out trucks that met Toyota's quality standards. The productivity and quality metrics at NUMMI outperformed GM's own plants. General Motors apparently learned from this and then mostly didn't apply what it learned. But that is a different video. The cultural shift that the Toyota pickup produced was larger than the sales numbers alone indicate. It changed what American buyers expected from a truck. Before the Japanese compact trucks became dominant in the market, the accepted understanding among American consumers was that trucks wore out, that owning a truck meant accepting higher maintenance costs, more frequent repairs, and eventual replacement. The Toyota pickup disproved this expectation by simply outlasting it. A generation of buyers who came of age with Toyota pickups in the 1970s and 80s formed opinions about vehicle reliability that shaped their purchasing behavior for the rest of their lives. The loyalty that Toyota built during this period was not brand loyalty in the marketing sense. It was earned loyalty, the kind that comes from an object performing reliably over a decade of hard use. This carried forward. Buyers who had owned a Toyota pickup in the 1980s bought Tacomas in the 1990s. Buyers who had Tacomas bought more Tacomas. The Toyota compact and mid-size truck franchise that the Hilux and its American variant established became one of the most durable customer relationships in automotive history. The Tacoma, which replaced the Toyota pickup nameplate in the U.S. in 1995, is still in production. It has been continuously the best-selling mid-size pickup truck in the United States for over 2 decades. The basic formula, overbuilt for class, conservative but proven engineering, corrosion resistance, conservative payload ratings with real-world capacity that exceeds them, is still recognizable in the current generation. The 22RE engine family that powered the most successful years of the Toyota pickup is still running, not as a curiosity, as transportation. In rural areas across North and South America, in agricultural regions of Africa and Southeast Asia, in farm fleets and small business operations, trucks built in the early and mid-1980s are still accumulating miles on engines that were designed to last this long. Parts are still available. Mechanics who have never worked on anything else still know how to work on them. The specific design choices that made this possible, the chain drive timing system, the conservative operating parameters, the corrosion treatment, the frame overengineering, were not accidents. They were the result of an engineering philosophy that prioritized useful life over initial cost, real-world durability over specification sheet performance. American manufacturers eventually absorbed this lesson, at least partly. The quality gap between American and Japanese compact trucks that was so stark in the early 1980s has substantially narrowed. Current Ranger and Colorado are genuinely competitive with the Tacoma on most measurable dimensions. The industry-wide improvement in vehicle longevity that American buyers now take for granted, 100,000-mile powertrain warranties, rust warranties that actually cover something, service intervals measured in years rather than months, is a downstream consequence of the competitive pressure that Toyota applied persistently. From 1972 forward, the small Japanese pickup truck with 89 horsepower and a modest price tag did not change the American truck market by being revolutionary. It changed it by being relentlessly, stubbornly, almost boringly correct in its engineering priorities year after year, while American manufacturers were optimizing for different things. The market eventually told everyone which priorities were right. The Toyota pickup did not win because it was exciting. It won because it showed up for work every morning, for 15 years, and the morning after that. That is, in the end, what you want from a truck. If you have a high-mileage Toyota pickup still running somewhere, I'd actually like to hear about it in the comments. What year, what you use it for, and what the odometer says. I know some of you have stories. Drop them below. And if you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. We cover engineering stories like this every week. More coming.